Before the household at Kensington Palace had properly awakened, while the corridors still held the grey chill of an English dawn, the door of a young woman's bedchamber opened, and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain were shown in with the stiff solemnity of men who have come to change a life. It was June 20th, 1837. The girl they faced was 18, slight in figure, not yet formed in mind for the magnitude of a crown, and still living under rules that had measured her hours, her visitors, her walks, even the arrangement of her rooms. They told her that William IV was dead, and that she was queen. She listened, asked that she might be alone, and, by a small act that reveals more than many proclamations, chose for the first time to conduct her own day. A monarchy that had been noisy with scandal, buffeted by reform, and diminished in the public's affection, had placed itself, almost by accident, in the hands of a disciplined, stubborn, intensely conscientious girl. The century that would take her name was already underway: steam, iron, factories, hunger, cities, pamphlets, empires. And it remained to be seen whether the crown would be a relic carried in procession or an institution that could learn the new art of reigning without ruling. She was born at Kensington Palace on May 24th, 1819, the child of a hasty dynastic salvage operation. The House of Hanover, prosperous in power and poor in domestic virtue, had found itself unexpectedly short of legitimate heirs. The death of Princess Charlotte in 1817 removed the one youthful figure whom the public could imagine as a future unifier of crown and affection. Victoria's father, Edward, Duke of Kent, one of George III's sons, married late, as did several of his brothers, and produced in her a solution that seemed at once precarious and providential. He died when she was an infant. The court's center of gravity shifted to her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and to the Duchess's ambitious companion, Sir John Conroy. From that small triangle of dependence, surveillance, and resentment arose the Kensington system, a regimen intended to keep the heiress sheltered, pliant, and grateful. It succeeded in making her lonely, observant, hungry for loyalty, and fiercely protective of her independence. Many revolutions begin as reactions against the management of one's private life. Victoria's first political education was the desire not to be governed. The England she inherited as a person and the Britain she inherited as a queen were not of one piece. The Industrial Revolution had already thrown a new continent of experience up against the old island of privilege. Machines multiplied goods and multiplied men. They also multiplied smoke, slums, injuries, and a kind of poverty that was no longer rural and resigned but urban and angry. The Reform Act of 1832 had widened the electorate and announced that the political class must, however reluctantly, bargain with new powers. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had reorganized relief with a sternness that pleased administrators and hardened the poor. Chartism was gathering force. Ireland was restless. The moralists were loud. The skeptics were growing in confidence. The monarchy, after the extravagances of George IV and the chilly respectability of William IV, needed not majesty alone, but character. Victoria supplied, in abundance, the one resource that modern politics rarely manufactures: a private life that could be made public without collapse. In her first years, she leaned heavily on Lord Melbourne, the Whig Prime Minister, who became at once tutor, protector, and the nearest thing to a fatherly intimacy permitted by her station. Melbourne's charm and patience steadied her. His party also benefited from a sovereign who, by temperament and gratitude, preferred their company. The arrangement was politically dangerous and personally formative. It taught her the pleasures of confidence and the habit of attaching political meaning to personal loyalty, an error common in those raised under domestic constraint. It also brought her early collision with the boundaries of constitutional monarchy. In 1839, when Melbourne resigned and Sir Robert Peel was called to form a government, Victoria resisted Peel's request that she replace some of her ladies-in-waiting who were closely tied to Whig leaders. The bedchamber crisis, as the newspapers christened it, was less about bedrooms than about power. The sovereign's household was one of the last territories where personal preference could still be political fact. Victoria's refusal helped return Melbourne to office, but it also taught her, at some cost, that a monarch who presses too openly on party questions invites the public to ask whether monarchy is necessary at all. In that early stumble lay the beginning of her later prudence. The young queen's reign began with public ceremony and private hazards. There were assassination attempts. One thinks of Edward Oxford firing at her carriage in 1840, not merely as melodramatic incidents, but as symptoms of a new age in which the sovereign moved among crowds and became a visible symbol to the discontented. Victoria's response was courage of a practical sort. She continued to appear, continued to ride, and refused to let fear set the rhythm of her duties. It is a modest virtue, but history is often redirected by modest virtues practiced consistently. Her decisive personal transformation came with marriage. In 1840, she married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a young German prince without a kingdom worthy of the name, but with a mind disciplined by work and a conscience sharpened by a Protestant seriousness. The match was political in the way royal matches always are, linking dynasties, consolidating alliances, but its deeper consequence was domestic. It created, at the center of the state, a household that would become a model, a myth, and a moral instrument. Victoria was passionate, willful, quick to anger. Albert was methodical, earnest, sometimes pedantic, and possessed of a modern faith in administration. Their union was not an idyll, it was an education. She learned to share authority in the one place where she had expected to be absolute. He learned to exercise influence without formal power, a delicate art in a country jealous of foreign interference and suspicious of any man who might seem to govern through the Queen. Albert's role in British life, for many years, was contested. He had no official constitutional place. The title Prince Consort came later. Yet he became, through labor and proximity, a kind of unofficial minister of culture and conscience. He cared about science, industry, education, reform, and the modernization of the monarchy's public face. He helped organize the Great Exhibition of 1851, that vast glass-housed celebration of industry and empire where Britain displayed to itself and the world a confidence in progress that bordered on religion. The Crystal Palace was not merely architecture, it was a secular cathedral, and Victoria and Albert presided over it as if over a rite of national self-belief. If one seeks the tone of the mid-Victorian spirit, its pride in invention, its faith in improvement, its blindness to the costs paid in human bodies and colonial subjects, one can find it reflected there. Meanwhile, the Queen's private life became astonishingly populous. She bore 9 children, and through them her bloodline spread into the royal houses of Europe. Her family became, in the later phrase, the grandmother of Europe, not through sentimental accident, but through dynastic arithmetic. This web of marriages did not prevent European rivalries. It could not tame the forces of nationalism, industrial competition, and imperial ambition. But it lent to the period a faint illusion of familial diplomacy, a hope that cousins might spare each other war. History, unmoved by family albums, would later show how thin such hopes were. Victoria's public role matured as Britain's political system evolved. The monarchy had been moving for generations from executive power toward symbolic authority. Under Victoria, that movement became a settled fact. She still influenced through counsel, correspondence, persistence, and access. She read state papers with care, wrote incessantly, and regarded her duties not as a theatrical burden, but as a moral obligation. Yet she had to learn that in a parliamentary age, the sovereign's will is most effective when it is indirect, and that the monarch who insists on being a political actor becomes, in the eyes of parties, a prize to be captured rather than a symbol to be shared. Her relationships with prime ministers reveal the shifting geometry of that system. With Peel, she found respect and, gradually, admiration. With Lord John Russell, the relations were cooler. With Palmerston, whose foreign policy was energetic and often reckless, she and Albert repeatedly clashed. They resented his habit of acting first and informing later, as if the crown were a ceremonial afterthought. Their resistance was not merely personal, it was a defense of the crown's remaining dignity in foreign affairs. Yet Palmerston's popularity showed another truth. In the age of newspapers and mass sentiment, a statesman could appeal over the heads of palace and parliament to a public increasingly confident of its own judgment. The great crises of her reign were not only British, they were imperial, European, and social. Ireland suffered catastrophe in the Great Famine of the 1840s, a calamity rooted in dependence on a single crop, but intensified by policy, ideology, and the cold logic of political economy. The Queen made gestures of concern and charity, but the structural facts, land tenure, absenteeism, export of food, the limits of relief, belonged to a state that governed Ireland with a mixture of neglect and coercion. The famine left scars that no royal sympathy could heal, and it deepened the moral problem of an empire that could proclaim progress while tolerating misery within the United Kingdom itself. In 1848, revolutions shook Europe, and Britain watched with a nervous confidence. Chartist agitation reached a peak. There were fears of upheaval. Yet Britain did not erupt as Paris did. Partly this was due to the resilience of British institutions, partly to the capacity for reform without rupture, and partly to the presence of safety valves, emigration, imperial expansion, and the absorbing demands of industry. The Queen and Albert, with their emphasis on domestic virtue and social order, represented for many the stability that the continent lacked. Here, the monarchy performed its modern function, not to command events, but to reassure a society that events could be born without tearing the fabric of life. The Crimean War, 1853–56, brought the monarchy into a new intimacy with public sentiment. The war revealed administrative incompetence, logistical chaos, and the ghastly cost of modern conflict. Florence Nightingale's work and the scandal of military mismanagement entered the popular imagination. Victoria was personally engaged. She visited wounded soldiers, supported reforms, and cultivated a language of national sacrifice. In earlier centuries, a monarch's presence in war might have meant command. In Victoria's time, it meant sympathy, patronage, and symbolic unity. It was a quieter form of power, but in a mass society, quiet powers can be durable. More far-reaching and more morally complex was the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The uprising, part mutiny, part revolt, part civil war, exposed the brittleness of the East India Company's rule and the depth of resentment produced by conquest, cultural intrusion, economic disruption, and administrative arrogance. The British response was brutal. The narratives on both sides were saturated with fear and revenge. Out of the crisis came a constitutional change, the end of company rule and the assumption of direct crown governance in India. In theory, this brought responsibility closer to the state. In practice, it enlarged the empire's moral burden. Victoria later issued proclamations that spoke of religious toleration and equal justice, and these words have often been quoted as if they were policy. The empire, however, was not governed by proclamations, but by interests, institutions, and a hierarchy of race and power that the age took for granted. Victoria was not the architect of imperialism, but her reign became its emblem, and the contradictions of the Victorian conscience Piety beside exploitation, humanitarian language beside domination, found in the empire their grandest stage. Albert's death in December 1861 struck the reign like a sudden winter. Victoria's grief was not decorative. It was consuming and, for years, politically damaging. She withdrew from public life, haunted by the memory of the one man who had disciplined her passions and given her a sense of partnership. The court darkened. The Queen's seclusion fed Republican murmurs and press hostility. In a society that had begun to treat monarchy as a public service, prolonged absence looked like dereliction. Yet it also revealed something human beneath the institution. A widow refusing consolation, clinging to ritual, converting love into an austere religion of memory. The Victorian age prized self-control. Victoria's grief was a refusal of the age's advice, and therefore, paradoxically, a kind of authenticity that many could understand even while they criticized it. During her widowhood, she formed intense attachments, notably to John Brown, a Scottish servant and attendant at Balmoral. The gossip of a court is always eager to turn intimacy into scandal. Historians have generally found more evidence of companionship and dependence than of romance. The deeper point is less the rumor than the need. A queen who had lost her partner sought, in a loyal and blunt presence, some substitute for the security Albert had supplied. It is a reminder that even the highest office cannot abolish the human appetite for ordinary fidelity. Meanwhile, the political nation moved on. The electorate expanded with the Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884. Party organization became more professional. Public opinion became a force that ministers courted and feared. Victoria's personal views were conservative in temperament, skeptical of radical change, uneasy with mass politics, disapproving of what she considered moral laxity, yet she was also a realist. She adapted, sometimes grudgingly, to the idea that the sovereign's task was to counsel, warn, and encourage, not to direct. Her correspondence shows a mind that could be sharp, persistent, and occasionally unfair, but rarely frivolous. She took her job seriously, which is, in a constitutional monarchy, the first qualification for usefulness. Her relations with Disraeli and Gladstone, the two great antagonists of later Victorian politics, became almost allegorical. She enjoyed Disraeli's flattery and theatrical loyalty. He treated the crown as a partner in national imagination, and he understood that a queen who felt respected would be less tempted to meddle. Gladstone, moral, intense, sometimes oblivious to personal tact, often exhausted her. She found him overbearing and doctrinaire, and she disliked the way his politics, especially on questions of Ireland and reform, seemed to threaten established order. These preferences mattered less in policy than in atmosphere, but atmosphere is not nothing. A monarchy lives by symbols, and symbols are shaped by relationships. In 1876, under Disraeli's government, Victoria took the title Empress of India. The gesture was partly imperial vanity, partly political calculation, an attempt to bind the monarchy to the expanding empire and to compete symbolically with other European powers. It also signaled a shift. The monarchy was becoming an imperial institution, not merely a British one. The crown's imagery now embraced not only the islands and their dominions, but the vast, unequal territories of Asia and Africa. In a time when many Britons believed empire to be a moral mission, the new title seemed natural. In retrospect, it reads as a formalization of domination. The later decades of her reign saw the monarchy's reputation restored through a mixture of necessity, performance, and time. Victoria gradually returned to public appearances. Her jubilees, golden in 1887, diamond in 1897, were not mere celebrations of longevity. They were rituals of national cohesion. Britain, by then, was the world's dominant industrial and naval power, and the empire had reached a scale that dazzled even those who barely understood it. The Jubilees staged a pageant of unity, but they also revealed the strange composition of the Victorian state: democracy growing at home, authority projected abroad, prosperity and poverty coexisting, religious certainty contending with scientific doubt. Victoria, old, small, and often physically weary, sat at the center of these contradictions like a figure carved for permanence, while everything around her changed. Her private world in those years included another intimate relationship, this time with Abdul Karim, a young Indian servant who became her munshi, teaching her Hindustani and offering a personal connection to the empire she symbolically ruled. The court resented him. Racial prejudice and bureaucratic jealousy combined with genuine concerns about influence. Victoria, stubborn to the end, defended him. Here again one sees her character, loyal to those she chose, resistant to pressure, capable of tenderness that ignored class and convention, yet also enclosed within the imperial structure that made such relationships possible on unequal terms. She died on January 22, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, after a reign of 63 years. The world that followed her was recognizably descended from hers, yet already sliding toward catastrophes her generation could scarcely imagine. The monarchy passed to Edward VII, and the Victorian era ended not because the forces that shaped it were exhausted, but because the face that had come to represent them had vanished. What, then, was Queen Victoria? Person, monarch, symbol? She was not a great intellect in the manner of a philosopher-king, nor a political innovator in the manner of a revolutionary. She did not make the Industrial Revolution, the empire, or parliamentary democracy. She was made by them, resisted them, accommodated them, and finally lent them a human outline. Her significance lies in the way her private virtues and private limitations met the needs of a society in transition. She offered continuity at a time of change, domestic respectability at a time of urban dislocation, and a conscience, sometimes narrow, often sincere, to a nation that wished to believe that power could be moral. If her age seems to us a house built of contradictions, it is because it was. It gave the world railways and slums, antisepsis and child labor, parliamentary reforms and colonial subjugation, earnest philanthropy and complacent inequality. Victoria stood at the hearth of that house, not lighting every fire, but insisting that the house endure. She helped transform monarchy from a governing power into a representative one, less a hand on the tiller than a lantern on the deck. And in doing so, she preserved the institution by stripping it, slowly and sometimes unwillingly, of the ambitions that had once made it dangerous. History is not kind to symbols when they outlive the beliefs that sustain them. Victoria's symbol endured because it was flexible. The crown could be draped in family life, in duty, in empire, in mourning, in celebration. Yet the essential fact remains simple and almost austere. An orphaned girl, trained to obedience and forged by resentment, became a queen who worked, loved, grieved, and persisted. She did not escape her century's moral blind spots, and she carried, with the empire, burdens she did not fully see. But she gave to a vast, quarrelsome, transforming nation the steady impression that the state had a heart, and that, for good or ill, the heart was faithful.